In order to celebrate the reopening of the Brora Distillery, Diageo have released the Brora Triptych Collection, and in this video we're going to take a look at everything you need to know about this exclusive series of bottles. In order to understand this new Triptych Collection that's being released, you need to have a bit of a understanding about the history of the distillery, and not just the Brora Distillery but also the Clynelish Distillery. Now, if you want a really in-depth guide to this, head over to the Mark Littler website. On the blog we've got a very in-depth history and a very useful timeline, but the bare bones of the situation is this. In 1819, the Clynelish Distillery, not Clynelish, Clynelish, the Clynelish Distillery was set up, and it ran on and off for just over 100 years or so, and then in 1967 a new distillery was built on the same site. So you've got the Clynelish Distillery here, and then Diageo build a new distillery here, pretty much neighbours to each other. And this new distillery was called Clynelish A, and the old distillery was called Clynelish B. Now in 1968, Clynelish B, which was the original distillery, remember, closed its doors, only to reopen them again a year later. So in 1969, Clynelish B, the original distillery, reopens its doors again. Now, because of the Scotch Whisky Association guidance, the two distilleries couldn't keep their names as Clynelish. They both couldn't be called Clynelish. So they had to rename the second distillery. So instead of calling the new distillery Brora and the old distillery Clynelish, they did it the other way around. So the new distillery that was built in 1967 was called Clynelish to piggyback off the fame and notoriety of the original distillery. And then the original distillery was renamed Brora. So, which is why you've got these whiskies, this 1972 rare malts, and this original sort of 1970s, 60s bottling of Clynelish here, are both from the same distillery, even though one's called Brora and one's called Clynelish. So depending on the time that you buy these bottles will depend on what's on the labels. So we bring this sort of forward. In 1983, the Brora distillery closed. It closed its doors completely. And it wasn't until 2017 that Diageo announced that it was going to be bringing the distillery back online again. And it spent £30 million between the Brora distillery and the Port Ellen distillery to bring them back online. Now, in 2019, Diageo releases the 40-year-old 200th anniversary bottling of the Brora distillery, and this is the bottle that currently holds the world record price for any Brora bottling, and I think it's just over £54,000 sold by Sotheby's, that bottle. So now we know a little bit more about the history of Clynelish and Brora, and how Clynelish, or how Brora is actually Clynelish and vice versa. We get to these bottles that have just been released by Diageo. So the Brora Triptych Collection is to celebrate the reopening of the distillery, and the bottles aren't going to be made available until the distillery opens its doors again. Now, being a new distillery opening, or an old distillery reopening, there's a premium to pay for these bottles. So, and with good reason too. There are 3 bottles as part of the Brora Triptych. There's a 48-year-old, a 43 and a 38. Now, the 48-year-old is the oldest public release of Brora to date, and it's called the Exclusive Legacy. And the real key feature about this bottle is that it is the oldest Brora bottling that's ever hit the market. The second bottling is a 43-year-old, and it's called the Age of Peat. And this is a 1970s vintage cask, and it's to celebrate the heavily peated whiskey that was made at the Brora distillery, particularly during the 1960s and 70s, when Brora was used as a substitute for the Kalila and Islay whiskies that were, well, Kalila closed in the 1960s for renovation, and Brora took on the workload of, producing this heavily peated whiskey for the blends that were being made at the time. And then the 38-year-old bottle is called the Timeless, and that's to celebrate the waxy character of Brora and Clynelish. So if you ever want to look at this, head over to Whisky Fun. There's loads of tasting notes on Brora and Clynelish, and this waxy character often comes through. So the presentation of these bottles is pretty remarkable. It's in this fantastic large wooden case. It looks like it's just been hewn out of a big piece of timber. And inside it, there are 3 of these bottles, one of the 48, one of the 43 and one of the 38. Now, the £30,000 a set, so it's big money for 3 bottles of whiskey. There's 300 sets being made available. So you're gonna, you do the math simply, it's a £9 million net project or gross project for the distillery. So they're gonna get £9 million from the sale of these bottles. And one of the things that's sort of like snipped by the wayside with this release is that these are 500ml bottles. So if you go back to the original 40-year-old release that was done in 2019, that was a 700ml bottle. And these bottles are 500ml. And why does that make much difference? Well, it's 28% smaller than a 700ml bottle. So, you're getting 28% less whiskey. If you do the numbers, I think they would have only been able to do 214 sets of each had they used 70cl bottles. And if you pro-rata the price, you would have got to about 42,000 a set, which is not as affordable if you can use affordable in relation to £30,000. But we are seeing more of a trend now for very exclusive bottlings to be in this sort of slightly smaller 500ml size. The new Macallans obviously are always sort of 700ml, but there are a few other instances that have been 500ml bottles and not the 700ml bottles. Another thing that makes a £30,000 price tag a little bit more reasonable is the fact that you get a distillery tour thrown in free of charge. So I think that's pretty kind of them to give you a free distillery tour. But I don't think this is going to be like your standard distillery tour. I'm pretty certain you'll be given the VIP works with that purchase. So there we have it. It's the Brora Triptych Collection. It's being released when the distillery reopens, and it's £30,000 a set. Now, will these bottles prove to be a good investment? Well, if you've got £30,000 to spend on 3 bottles of 500ml whiskey, then you know what? I think they probably will. The Brora brand is really growing with all this new marketing that's coming around these new, the distillery reopening. Whisky Auctioneer a few weeks ago had the first ever Brora specific auction, and I think for Diageo to generate a return on their investment, they have to do lots more of these high value, high yielding releases, because they don't have any new whiskey to start, any young whiskey to release. The distillery is not yet producing, so we're going to be looking at 3 years at least until we start getting the no age statement bottlings, which again, given the pedigree, are probably going to be quite expensive, I would have thought. So there we have it, it's the fantastic Brora Triptych Collection. And if you've got any bottles of Brora that you're looking to buy or sell, please head to the Mark Littler website and we'll be happy to help.